Sorry, coming back. My time limit. I have a time limit on my phone that uh, so that I'm aware of how much I'm using my phone. I'm trying not to use it too much, but it just went off in the middle of that lecture. So I'm back. I'm on page 16 of the Communist Manifesto. We're talking about how Marx saw and acknowledged the revolutionary power of capitalism to, again, create our modern world to a large degree, to pull us out of the idiocy of feudalism where there was basically stasis and there wasn't dynamic change and the means of production weren't constantly being shifted and developed, okay? The bourgeoisie, I'm on the fourth full paragraph of page 16. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole of relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of the existence of all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all others. And that uncertainty, it comes to a head when you really feel it is in crises like the current one we're living in. With their train of all fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient, venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. That's a famous image from this text. All that's solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relation with his kind. That last sentence, hopeful more than descriptive, that we'll come into the state where most of us are now dispossessed, we're working, we have nothing to lose but our chains, as the end of the text says, and we have a world to win if we organize and fight against this few, the 1%, as Bernie calls it, or whatever, the owners of the means of production. But just going back to what he's saying here about constant revolutionary production, uninterrupted of disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all previous earlier ones. Just to give you some illustrations of that constant revolutionizing of production. Think about, some of you probably don't even remember, you're not old enough, but think about how it was to hail a taxi cab 10 years ago in New York City. You hoped for a yellow cab, and maybe one came. And those cabs, to own the medallion was very lucrative because there was basically a fixed number of them, and that was it. And they had the special privilege of being able to hail. You could call Arecibo and Park Slope or whatever the car service is by you and call them on the phone and they would come get you. But that was a hassle compared to just raising your hand. Now, the means of coordinating that has been revolutionized by smartphone technology, the internet, cellular data, and all developed in the public sector, by the way. All that technology was not developed in the market. It was privatized once it was developed, but that's another story. And then suddenly we have Uber and Lyft and so on. And guess what? To own that taxi medallion is no longer valuable. And to be a regular cabbie the way there used to be, and you could kind of have a lower middle class existence, is no longer the case. There's suddenly tons of different cab drivers, all basically working as independent contractors for this mega corporation called Uber that's just being funded by all kinds of billionaire money from Silicon Valley. How can a regular guy with a medallion compete against that? They can't. So medallions go down in value. People lose their shirt. They go bankrupt trying to pay these worthless mortgages they have on taxi medallions. Cabbies are committing suicide. The wages for cabbies overall go down and down and down. That's this agitation he's talking about. The changes, the revolution in the means that capitalism introduces does not necessarily lead to improvement in working people's lives, but it does lead to profits for elite, powerful interests, okay? And it's often at the expense of working people. That's one illustration of this concept. And you could go on and on with others. But let's turn to so Marx is and really Marx's I'll show you his most famous book. I'll show you Marx. There's often this criticism. Marx didn't say much about communism. Well, yeah, because what did he know about it? He knew about this Capital. There's 3 volumes. The other 2 are at work. All my Marx books are at work right now. But this is Capital Volume 1. Marx was a great student of capitalism. That's why he's remained such an enduring figure. Is he wasn't describing pie in the sky stuff. He was describing the world as it was. Okay, the real material conditions of ordinary people and their masters, and trying to make the world better for working people. So let's look at what he did say a little bit though in this text about what it would mean to put in place the changes they were asking for, and then I'll end by bringing in the Kropotkin stuff that Gould is talking about. So I'm on 26 now, page 26. Bottom of 26. This whole second section. So that first one's about who are the bourgeoisie? They're these revolutionary force in history, but their time is coming to an end. And Marx said that 150, maybe 170 years too soon. But I'm being optimistic now. And that the proletariat were going to actually unleash even more, because it would be in the good of all and everything, the productive potential of the industrialization that had happened under the capitalist system. And then the second section, he goes into all these, it's sort of like a back and forth. You say this about this, but this is what it really is. You say this about us, but this is what it really is. You say this about us, but this is what it really is. And he culminates this in saying, okay, so what is it really? It's this program. These are our demands. This is what it would mean to put in place the changes we want. And I'll tell you what, you guys, these changes are in place. Much of what goes for quote unquote free market capitalist society these days, people call it neoliberalism, meaning a return to the fundamental belief in the market doing everything for us, and that you can't have a system without the market mechanism and so on. Neoliberalism, not in Barack Obama liberalism, but like free market, laissez-faire capitalism from the 19th century. Neoliberal in that sense, new again. What would it mean to put in place all these changes? Well, you see when you look at this list that basically we're living in a quasi-communist society already. Marx and Engels were just trying to make things decent for people. So, for example, and these are some of them strike you as radical, but some of them maybe not, especially given our current economic crisis that's been brought on by this contingent event of this pandemic virus. Okay, but even that, if you read a Marxist thinker like Mike Davis, and I'll link on Blackboard to a couple of his articles, the dice are being loaded for more and more of these viruses by the sort of chaotic nature of development these days. For example, Ebola emerged, they now speculate, from people interacting and eating wild game in Africa. Why? Because of their traditional fishery areas in Gulf of Guinea and so on were being overfished by multinational corporations. And so how can a normal fisherman compete with that? They can't. And they have to seek other means of subsistence. They eat something they're not used to eating, and a virus emerges from that. Okay, that's literally the odds of that kind of thing happening are increasing under the current distribution of power and economic political power in our capitalist world, where giant corporations have more power than most countries do. Okay, but look at this list on the bottom of 26. 1, this is to implement a communist revolution. 1, abolition of property and land, and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Now, don't think of that as property and land in the sense that you can't own an apartment or you can't have a mortgage on a house and so on. He's talking literally about something that didn't exist now that you take for granted. Public ownership of land that's too important to be put into private hands. For example, national parks. Yellowstone, Grand Canyon. Imagine opening that up to development. For me, that's a moral abomination. That's not cool. You're talking about people coming there and ripping the oil out of the ground, ruining the natural environment to make money in a very short term period, and then it's someone else's problem to deal with the cleanup. Okay, uh, and the abolition of rent, rent. That's a question right now. If 30% of the public suddenly becomes unemployed, how are they going to pay rent? You got to have a freeze. You got to have you got to have an abolition. And rent itself, making a living that way, that's not productive capitalism. That's not cool. Building a Tesla, building an iPhone, doing imaginative shit under capitalism sort of profit taking. That's unproductive use of the relationship of private ownership. Okay, so rent is not something most people laud as a fact of capitalism, but it's a way a lot of people make a ton of money under, including our president, who's a noted landlord. Two, heavy progressive and graduate income tax. Again, this is in place. Or it was until the last 40 years of reactionary conservative politics did away with progressive income taxes, so that today the richest in New York City pay the same city taxes as the poorest. And you see what happens. Roads don't work. Subway systems don't work. Schools are crumbling. You've been in CUNY classrooms that are cold in the winter and hot in the summer and so on. So progressive taxes, again, in the middle of the 20th century, they were as high as 80-90% on top earners, and the society did just fine. It was better than ever, really. That was the golden age of capitalism, was when the state was having these sorts of measures. Okay, abolition of all right of inheritance. Again, most billionaires, most wealthy people, that's how they got rich. They were born into it. They inherited it. That's a fact of life. It's not one that's normally seen that way. Look at number 5. This is true of every advanced country now. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank. There's at the time when this was written, there were very few national banks. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing to cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Again, state planning, long-term investment, and all this sort of stuff. Our country does that. That's how the internet was made. Who do you think builds the roads and the infrastructure, or neglects them when conservatives are there and they don't want money spent on things that would benefit you and me and ordinary people? Equal liability to all to work. If you saw the movie, the Marx, young Karl Marx, there's this. It's not a great movie, but there's a couple interesting points dramatically rendered, and one is where they confront, Engel's family being rich. He was a member of this kind of country club, gentleman's club, and they confront his father's friend, who's also a manufacturer, and Marx says to him, yeah, if we change the relations of production, you'd have to work too. You'd have to sweat with your hands and toil for your livelihood, just like everyone else. So equal liability of all to work, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. You can see Marx describing like a Green New Deal there, essentially. That there was already environmental breakdown from industrialization. People were already trying to think about, how do we do this more systematically? Gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of populace over the country. Okay, so again, not these, and this isn't so much a problem in our society, but if you look at the global south, many cities in the global south, take Mexico City for example, there's no organization to how people live. They live in illegal developments, slums, shanty towns, so on. 60% of them are working informally, not in a job with a paycheck and taxable income and so on. Okay, so these things are necessary. And then look at this last one. At the time when this was written in 1840s and all the way into the 20th century America, little kids went to work in the most cruel, degrading factory conditions. Okay, and that's still true all over the world today. Free education for all, children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in the present form, combination of education with industrial production. In other words, you could go to work, your job, and then your job would have to pay to keep educating you, for example. But also, no public schools at the time. We've had every society with K through 12 free public education is, in effect, by definition, textbook definition, communist. And no wonder conservatives hate it so much and try to undermine public education, because they know when you educate people, you're creating your enemies. You're creating people who will understand that they're being cheated, they're being robbed, and that they're going and that they might organize themselves and fight back. It's a great danger of public education. Okay, so, and there's one last thing about it. Imagine if think about all the clothes you wear. They're made by kids. They're made by teenagers. They're made by adolescents on the other side of the world making nothing. Imagine if these rules were in place everywhere. I mean, our societies have benefited immensely from the investment in public education. And this is a struggle right now in the political campaigns to have free higher education, which we used to have until the 1970s, when suddenly, Nixon realized he was creating an educated proletariat, and that was dynamite. That was going to explode the conditions. And ever since they've been charging you more and more to go to college. But imagine if all over the world kids could go to school instead of going to work in factories. Wouldn't we then find, as Gould once said, he didn't care about the weight of Einstein's brain. He cared about the fact that it was virtually certain that people of Einstein's caliber had spent their whole life as slaves, spent their whole life picking up after other people, had not been able to develop their capacities and give their gifts to us the way a lucky few have been able to, thanks to the fortunes of birth and the circumstances of their upbringing and so on. Okay, so that's really what Marx is about. The old slogan, from each according to his means. Are you smart? Then you help us. And to each according to his needs. Okay? Give to each what he needs and get from each the potential of his abilities. More next week. That's all for now. Work on your Benjamin essays and stay safe out there in the crisis. Good luck.